the first speech is of Professor Lawrence Venuti. Lawrence Venuti is a long-time friend of the NIDA Institute, at least from the conference we organized in 2001 here in New York, titled Similarity and Difference in Translation. So I'm delighted to introduce him. He is professor of English at Temple University and is a member of the editorial boards of many journals, The Translator, Studies in Intercultural Communication and Translation, Reformation, the Journal of the Tyndale Society, and of course of our journal, Translation. Lawrence is a well-known translator from Italian to English, and his translation projects have won awards and grants from Pan American Center, from the Italian government, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is the author of The Translator's Invisibility, A History of Translation, and Scandals of Translation, Towards an Ethics of Difference. These books have many translations in many languages, including Italian and Spanish and Catalan. I had a Catalan translation of Scandals. And translation changes everything, theory and practice. And he is also the editor of the Translation Studies Reader. The title of his lecture is Genealogies of Translation Theory, Locke and Schleiermacher. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lawrence Venuti. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a handout, if anyone doesn't have one. You're going to need it. You need a program to follow this game. Okay. Like everyone, I'm very grateful to the organizers for, sponsoring this event and just getting us all together to talk about translation. But I also want to thank Jean Nida, an old friend, no longer with us. In a very real sense, we're here because of Jean Nida. So I'll be talking about him in various ways. So I have to apologize. I'm going to read a paper at you. I don't have any PowerPoint or anything. I promise you, this paper knows you are out there. Okay. But it's easier to deliver this. I can be more coherent, I hope. Theoretical statements about the nature of translation from antiquity to the present display a basic structure that allows for a precise articulation of their assumptions and the implications of those assumptions, both conceptual and practical. This structure typically consists of one or more theoretical concepts linked to one or more linguistic strategies, so that the strategy is seen as a practical realization of the concept. The concepts fall into three broad categories, which are interconnected and mutually defining. One, the relative autonomy of the translated text. That is to say, whatever features or procedures distinguish it from the source text that it translates, or from original compositions in general. Two, equivalence, or the relation of correspondence established between the source and translated text. And three, the function performed by the translation, which can range from the communication of information or the production of a particular response in the reader to an institutional or social impact with diverse consequences, cultural, economic, or political, among others. In a translation theory, the connections among the constitutive concepts and between those concepts and discursive strategies can be complicated because so often the theoretical statement is incompletely formulated or unevenly developed. It may not include or give equal emphasis to each of the three categories that delimit a translation theory. It may also concentrate on a concept, one concept, to the exclusion of any link to a discursive strategy, or, conversely, on a strategy without any formulation of the concept that might provide an explanation or justification. Yet, Whatever form the theoretical statement may take, it rests on a model, an underlying assumption as to the nature of translation, which is not only paradigmatic, but generative. Although it may never be stated explicitly, the model projects theoretical concepts or discursive strategies, or both. That is to say, concepts linked to strategies. The model, moreover, is itself based on an even more fundamental assumption, a theory of language, of its properties and functions. Only two models recur in centuries of theoretical statements. One I shall call instrumental, the other hermeneutic. On the empiricist assumption that language is direct expression or reference, the instrumental model treats translation as the reproduction or transfer of an invariant, which the source text contains or causes, typically described as its form, its meaning, or its effect. On the materialist assumption that language is creation thickly mediated by linguistic and cultural determinants, the hermeneutic model treats translation as an interpretation of the source text, whose form, meaning, and effect are seen as variable, subject to inevitable transformation during the translating process. These models are ideal constructs, which may never appear in the abstract formulations I have given them, in which case they must be inferred from the theoretical concepts and discursive strategies to which they give rise. Each model can generate multiple concepts and strategies, but their very nature leads to certain emphases and exclusions. Instrumentalism tends to emphasize concepts of equivalence and strategies designed to secure it. Think of the classical dichotomy between word for word and sense for sense translation, or Eugene Nida's principle of equivalent effect, both of which suppress the ways in which the relative autonomy or function of the translated text might undermine equivalence. Theoretical statements generated by the hermeneutic model, in contrast, tend to emphasize that very autonomy, how the translated text mediates and transforms its source, often to serve particular functions. Think of Derrida's paradox. Nothing is translatable, but everything is translatable, which puts into question, to say the least, the possibility of equivalence. Clearly, the two models are logically opposed, one stressing invariance, the other variability, one essentialist, the other contingent. In the history of translation theory, this binary opposition has been structured as a hierarchy. The millennia-long domination of the instrumental model deferred and then marginalized the articulation and development of its hermeneutic counterpart, repressing the kind of thinking that would question the notion of a source invariant and open the source text to variable interpretation. Yet, the opposition is in fact not a strict binary. Both models have sometimes underpinned accounts of theoretical concepts and discursive strategies, resulting in omissions and inconsistencies, regardless of whether the model most effective in shaping the commentary is instrumental or hermeneutic. So in what I'm going to present, I will deploy this very rapidly sketched account of the structures of translation theory in discussing two key documents. John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, you have the handout, 1689, 1690, and Friedrich Schleiermacher's 1813 lecture on the different methods of translating. Locke's project is primarily epistemological, an investigation of the origins and nature of knowledge, and he comments only sporadically on translation. Nonetheless, the result of his comments is to give an empiricist foundation to the instrumental model, producing a notion of translation whose influence stretches into the 21st century, right down to today. Schleiermacher's lecture, in contrast, assumes the hermeneutic model, posing the problem of cultural difference, which subsequently became central to thinking about language and translation, although without appreciably weakening the ascendancy of instrumentalism among translators, translation theorists and commentators, and readers of translated texts, whether professional or popular. My discussion of these documents is critical. I explore their omissions and inconsistencies so as to expose the limitations of the concepts and strategies set forth by each thinker. Any such critique can be mounted only from a particular theoretical position that differs from that of its object. Mine is rigorously hermeneutic. My aim is to argue that translation research and practice cannot advance until instrumentalism is not simply abandoned, but replaced by an understanding of translation that is based on a more sophisticated version of the hermeneutic model. That's my project. Killing off instrumentalism. Although Locke's rare comments on translation occur mainly when he addresses the relation between language use and the acquisition of knowledge, they do reveal a fairly precise notion of what translation is. At one point, he draws a distinction between definition and translation. A definition, he asserts, I think that's something you have. Yeah, I'm going to come up to this passage. But first, let me set the context. A definition, Locke asserts, this is a quote, is nothing else but the showing the meaning of one word by several other not synonymous terms. End of quote. He then proceeds to question definitions proposed by the schools. That's his term. His example is taken from Thomas Aquinas, as well as by what he calls modern philosophers, who, he explains, translate the term motion rather than define it. And that's number one of the Locke extracts. I'm just going to read this out. Nothing like some 17th century prose to clear your head. The atomists who define motion to be a passage from one place to another, what do they more than put one synonymous word for another? For what is passage other than motion? And if they were asked what passage was, how would they better define it than by motion? For is it not at least as proper and significant to say passage is a motion from one place to another, as to say motion is a passage, etc.? This is to translate and not to define. When we change two words of the same signification, one for another, which, when one is better understood than the other, may serve to discover what idea the unknown stands for. But is very far from a definition, unless we will say every English word in the dictionary is the definition of the Latin word it answers, and that motion is a definition of motus. Nor will a successive application of the parts of the superficies of one body to those of another, which the Cartesians give us, prove a much better definition of motion when well examined. For Locke, translation differs from definition in being synonymy. Regardless of whether the translation is intralingual, rewording in the same language, or interlingual, rendering into a different language. Locke regards synonymy, moreover, as complete equivalence of meaning. Hence, he refers to translation occurring between two words of the same signification, where signification seems to refer to an inherent meaning shared by two words that might differ in other ways, whether according to grapheme, phonology, or etymology, like motion and passage. Yet Locke can make these claims only on the basis of a more fundamental concept of translation, namely the instrumental model. His reference to two words of the same signification implies the existence of a semantic invariant that transcends not only the immediate context in which a word is located, but any differences in meaning that might derive from other features of that word, whether etymological or graphematic, phonological or syntactical, as well as from its use in other contexts, whether discursive or institutional, cultural or historical. Locke's instrumentalism thus privileges the category of equivalence, while suppressing factors that would constitute the relative autonomy of the translation from the source language word that it renders. Yet, is not definition a form of translation? It was Roman Jakobson who first used the term intralingual translation for rewording, or what he described as an interpretation of verbal signs by means of other signs of the same language. Noting that, this is a quote from Jakobson, the intralingual translation of a word uses either another, more or less synonymous word, or resorts to a circumlocution. Jakobson links translation with synonymy, like Locke, but he differs in arguing that, this is another quote from Jakobson, synonymy, as a rule, is not complete equivalence. Jakobson sees no substantive distinction between definition and translation. He asserts that, another quote, the meaning of any linguistic sign is its translation into some further alternative sign. What stops Locke from treating definition as a form of translation? Consider his example, the term motion. He describes this term as the name of a simple idea, which can only be got by experience, in his words, or in other words, by those impressions objects themselves make on our minds, by the proper inlets appointed to each sort, where inlets refers to the senses. A simple idea issues directly from sense perception, which makes the name for it, in Locke's words, incapable of being defined. Whereas what he calls a complex idea consists of several simple ones, and this composition allows the name for any complex idea to be represented by the several terms of a definition. For Locke, a simple idea can be translated but not defined, and a chain of completely equivalent translations can be established between an object or process that exists in the world, the sense perception of that object or process, the idea created in the mind by the perception, and the term chosen to signify the idea. It is clearly his empiricism that not only leads him to distinguish between translation and definition, but underwrites his assumption of an instrumental model, whereby different terms for the same simple idea are interchangeable, and a term reproduces an idea which in turn reproduces the sense perception that originates the idea. This series of invariants is ontologically grounded. It begins in an object or process that is given, never interpreted or constructed for knowledge, as with other philosophical discourses. Yet, Locke does in fact perform an interpretation. When he asserts that philosophers translate but mistakenly believe they define simple ideas, in the same stroke, he interprets and judges as unacceptable the definitions offered by competing philosophical discourses, whether Aristotelian-based scholasticism, atomistic corpuscularism, or Cartesian rationalism. The basis of his value-laden interpretation is his empiricist discourse, presented both as a theory of transparent language and as a theory of reality-based knowledge. Locke's empiricism works as an interpretant that simultaneously enables and conceals an interpretive act, as well as its function as a discursive condition of that act. This discourse mediates not only between each of his categories, the sequence that extends from reality to perception to idea to term, but also between competing philosophical discourses and his assessments of them. Yet, empiricism, by the very nature of its thinking, causes the presence of any mediation to disappear. As Michael Ayres notes, to say that knowledge of the world has foundations in sensory or perceptual knowledge is in effect to say that in sense perception, some knowledge is given prior to both inference and theory. Empiricism, however, is a theory. Locke does recognize the cultural and social conditions of language use, but they wind up becoming an obstacle to translation. These conditions motivate the combination of simple ideas to form complex ones, a broad and heterogeneous category in which Locke classifies concepts from various fields, mental processes, psychological states, physical activities, and cultural practices. Here's a catalog of his examples. Reprieve. These are examples of complex ideas. Reprieve. Assent. Testiness. Running. Murder. wrestling, etching. Locke's account of how such complex ideas are formed is functionalist. The process is caused by what he calls the end of language, which being to mark or communicate men's thoughts to one another with all the dispatch that may be, they usually make such collections of ideas into complex modes and affix names to them, as they have frequent use of in their way of living and conversation. End of quote. As a result, Locke argues, the terms for complex ideas tend to be untranslatable, or at least to lack a precise translation into other languages. People of one country, he explains, by their customs and manner of life, have found occasion to make several complex ideas and give names to them, which others never collected into specific ideas, so that there exists a great store of words in one language which have not any that answer them in another. End of quote. Locke's notion of untranslatability results from his empiricist reduction of language to reality. He asserts that all our complex ideas are ultimately resolvable into simple ideas, of which they are compounded and originally made up, whereby he establishes an unbroken link between the term for an abstraction and the most basic sense perceptions. Yet, this empiricist reduction mystifies the interpretive moves at work not only in translation, but in the formation of complex ideas. Among the words that Locke cites as untranslatable are two from ancient Greek and Latin: ostrokismos amongst the Greeks and proscriptio amongst the Romans, which he claims were words which other languages had no names that exactly answered, because they stood for complex ideas which were not in the minds of the men of other nations. The Greek word, ostrokismos, this is derived from the noun ostrokon, meaning an earthen vessel, but it came to signify an Athenian practice of ostracism or banishment, meted out to citizens who acquired so much power through wealth or associates that they were perceived as threats to the democratic state. The vote to ostracize them was cast with earthen tiles. Okay. The Latin word proscriptio was derived from the verb proscribere, meaning to exhibit a thing for sale by means of a bill or advertisement. But under the dictator Sulla, it came to signify the practice of executing and confiscating the property of citizens declared to be enemies of the state. Their names were printed on a list posted in the forum. Although both words were coined from previously existing words, which refer to specific objects and practices, neither supports Locke's contention that the complex idea signified by the word can be understood as a mere combination or collection of simple ideas based on sense perception. An interpretive act has intervened through the application of an interpretant, a political or ideological code enabling the words to support different meanings that serve specific social interests. This code obviously originated in the cultural and social conditions where the words took on the new meanings. But again, contrary to Locke's contention, it did not make the words untranslatable. For centuries before Locke's period, the words had been translated into English with the cognates, ostracism, and proscription, usually in contexts that define their meanings with precision, as in Thomas North's 1579 version of Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans. Paradoxically, Locke's notion of untranslatability obtains only if the words are removed from actual texts and a translation is attempted in an ideal situation that transcends any specific historical moment. He invokes the cultural and social conditions of language use only to imagine an instance of translation that transcends them. At another point, Locke does recognize the cultural and social determinants of language that might constrain meaning, but he does not abandon the instrumental model of translation. This is number 2 on the extracts. He imagines a pictorial dictionary wherein, as he describes it, words standing for things which are known and distinguished by their outward shapes should be expressed by little drafts and prints made of them. A vocabulary made after this fashion would, perhaps with more ease and in less time, teach the true signification of many terms, especially in languages of remote countries or ages, and settle truer ideas in men's minds of several things, whereof we read the names in ancient authors, than all the large and laborious comments of learned critics. Toga, tunica, pallium are words easily translated by gown, coat, and cloak. But we have thereby no more true ideas of the fashion of those habits amongst the Romans than we have of the faces of the tailors who made them. Locke acknowledges that translation is a decontextualizing process that detaches a foreign word from the linguistic patterns, cultural traditions, and social formation in which it is used and received, so that its replacement by a word in the translating language does not communicate its true signification. Hence, he proposes the creation of a pictorial dictionary, which in effect constitutes an interpretant, a visual representation that mediates between the foreign language word and the translating language word, so as to ensure that a univocal meaning is transferred between them. The interpretant, however, precisely because it takes the form of drafts and prints, fragments and proliferates rather than transfers meaning. A pictorial dictionary would introduce a complicated bibliographic code that includes printing formats, conventions of pictorial representation, images of Roman antiquity that figure in artworks and historical treatises, whether past or contemporary. Far from fixing meaning, the dictionary releases a potentially unlimited semiosis through which the foreign word is further recontextualized. A similar problem occurs with Locke's assertion that toga, tunica, pallium are words easily translated by gown, coat, and cloak, where he ignores not only the differences between the Latin and English terms, differences that hinge on patterns of usage, but also his own reliance on early modern lexicons. From Geoffrey the Grammarian's Promptorium Pavolorum, a storeroom for young scholars, 1499, to Edward Phillips's The New World of English Words, 1658, the Latin word toga was repeatedly defined as gown, whereas at least since the 19th century, it has been defined as the outer garment of a Roman citizen. That's a quote from Lewis and Short's dictionary, 1879. Locke assumes that words, even if detached from their originary context and inserted into another receiving context, still contain an essential meaning that can be reproduced or transferred in translation. Locke's empiricism supports his assumption of an instrumental model by masking the interpretation that any translation inscribes in the source text, transforming it at every level. Perhaps the most egregious consequence of this mystification is the suppression of the ideological determinations of the inscription. This becomes apparent in a passage where Locke considers various errors, that's his term, errors, including those, as he defines them, occasioned by a true hypothesis or right principles, but not rightly understood, end of quote. His illustration is taken from two French translations of a Greek word that appears in the New Testament, and that's number 3, okay? Yes, number 3, okay? So this is the idea of the errors. I'll begin in the the third sentence. The instances of men contending for different opinions, which they all derive from the infallible truth of the scripture, are an undeniable proof of this kind of error. Okay? All that call themselves Christians allow the text that says metanoete to carry in it the obligation to a very weighty duty. But yet, however erroneous will one of their practices be, who understanding nothing but the French, take this rule with one translation to be repentez-vous, repent, or with the other, faites pénitence, do penance. The two French translations each reflect different theological or doctrinal interpretations. Repentez-vous is a Protestant rendering, emphasizing justification by faith, as well as the rejection of the sacrament of penance, whereas Faites Penitence is a Catholic rendering, emphasizing justification by works, as well as the need to perform the sacrament. In Locke's view, neither French rendering is correct in itself, so that to choose one to the exclusion of the other would lead to practices that are erroneous. Simply to repent would be an extreme sectarian position, Calvinist, whereas simply to do penance, as in the Catholic sacrament, would be another extreme, Papist. Locke suggests that the Greek contains a semantic invariant, which is incorrectly reproduced by choosing either of the French renderings, and which might be phrased as follows, in my words. This is a translation. Show your faith by repenting and doing good works that display your repentance, since neither faith nor a good work is sufficient on its own. This invariant, however, does not exist in the Greek. Locke has inscribed the word with his own moderate Protestant theology, in implying that the meaning of the Greek combines both French renderings. What he regards as an accurate translation is actually ideological, reflecting his own religious belief in his historical moment. He does not need to make explicit what he sees as the right rendering, because his primary audience is a like-minded group, the men of the Royal Society, those few friends, as he calls them, to whom he intended his work to provide satisfaction, that's his word, concerning epistemological questions. Locke's essay concerning human understanding was revolutionary in its own time, especially because it was grounded on possessive individualism, the notion that to be human is to be born with skills which one is free to use to serve one's own interests, or more precisely, the concept of human subjectivity as complete conscious control over meaning, knowledge, and action. This concept proved to be as crucial to Locke's empiricist epistemology as to his liberal political philosophy. Yet what enabled his break from metaphysical concepts of subjectivity that privileged received wisdom, that legitimated class hierarchies, and that limited scientific research has been disastrous for translation theory and commentary. Locke's thinking about translation is riddled with unacknowledged interpretive acts, but his empiricism renders them invisible by conceiving of language as an expression of ideas or as a representation of reality that is direct and untroubled, thereby construing translation as the transparent vehicle of the source text. Near the end of the 18th century, another very different theory of translation emerged among the German Romantics. It received its most influential formulation in Schleiermacher's lecture, where translating methods, Methoden, are seen as producing a specific understanding, Verstandes, of the source text. Schleiermacher argues that only two methods exist. In Susan Bernofsky's English version, either the translator leaves the writer in peace as much as possible and moves the reader toward him, or he leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the writer toward him. Translation is thus not synonymy or the transposition of words with like or identical meanings. It's rather a means of fostering an intersubjective understanding in which a reader comes to comprehend the linguistic and cultural differences that a foreign writer has signified, a foreign language writer has signified in the source text. Moreover, the understanding is never complete, only approximate, a matter of as much as possible. Establishing equivalence as a variable concept that the translator must define anew with each source culture, language, and text to be translated. This point becomes clear when Schleiermacher describes more specifically the kind of translating that sends the reader abroad toward the foreign writer. And that is number 1 in the Schleiermacher extracts. In this case, in the case of this method, the translator must take it as his goal to furnish his reader with just such an image and just such enjoyment as reading the work in the original language would have provided the well-educated man, whom we are in the habit of calling, in the best sense of the word, an amateur and connoisseur, a man who is well acquainted with the foreign language, yet to whom it remains nonetheless foreign, who must no longer think each detail through in his mother tongue like a schoolboy before he is able to grasp the whole, yet who, even where he can take pleasure unhindered in the beauty of a work, remains ever conscious of the differences between this language and his mother tongue. Unlike Locke, Schleiermacher does not assert that a translation can provide a reader with unmediated access to the meaning or true signification of a foreign word or text, with or without a dictionary, whether or not pictorial. Instead, a translation is treated as an image. You can see the German word there in the first line, Bild. Okay? It's a representation that is relatively autonomous from the source text. This image, furthermore, reflects not native proficiency in the source language, but only a familiarity, geläufig, only a familiarity with the source language, so that the foreignness of the source language remains perceptible to the translator, who therefore produces a translation that somehow registers or signals the linguistic and cultural differences that he or she experiences upon reading the source text. With Schleiermacher, the idea of mediation enters translation theory decisively for the first time, and with it, the hermeneutic model. Here, translation is seen as communicating not the source text, but an interpretation of it, one among different interpretive possibilities that can be formulated apart from the translation process and that are inscribed with different linguistic strategies. A translation stands at 2 removes from the source text. It is said to imitate an understanding of the original language. Schleiermacher's thinking about translation is in fact closely allied to his hermeneutics, where the unit of interpretation is the text, and every text must be interpreted in terms of linguistic patterns and cultural traditions, as well as an individual writer's selection and deployment of those patterns and traditions. This is Schleiermacher. Everything in a given utterance, he says, which requires a more precise determination, may only be determined from the language area which is common to the author and his original audience. Schleiermacher recognizes the need to contextualize a text in order to understand it. But unlike Locke, he finds useless any attempt to reduce the unit of interpretation to the word. If one analyzes an utterance into its individual parts, Schleiermacher observes, every part is indeterminate. This is a remarkable assertion that can be read as implying that the same text can support multiple, possibly conflicting interpretations, and that a particular interpretation can only be excluded by philological and historical research. That is to say, by the interpreter's creation of one context to the exclusion of other different contexts. Schleiermacher acknowledges that his preferred translation method of signaling the foreignness of the source text can give rise to schools, that's his word, so that, I'm quoting here from Bernowski's translation, even though it is the same method that forms the basis of each school, different translations of the same work made from different points of view will be able to coexist because they apply different concepts of equivalence. One approximating the original language, this is Schleiermacher, while the other insists that no violence be done to its own language, end of quote. Schleiermacher has been described as straddling Enlightenment and Romantic thinking. Certainly, the rational precision he sought to bring to interpretation and translation seems akin to Locke's philosophical project of grounding knowledge on a rational basis derived from sense perception. For Schleiermacher, the more strict practice, that's his term, or his phrase, the more strict practice of interpretation assumes that misunderstanding results as a matter of course. That's a quote. And the interpreter proceeds then through the elimination of error, similar to the scientific method. Yet unlike Locke, but like every other early German romantics, But like other early German romantics, Schleiermacher harbors a notion of unknowability, of approximate understanding, constrained by the interpreter's or translator's own linguistic and cultural determinations. In line with this notion of unknowability, Schleiermacher's hermeneutic approach to translation rests on what I'm going to call a materialism, in which the subject and language are reciprocally determining. Every human being, he asserts, is on the one hand in the power of the language he speaks, but on the other hand, every free-thinking, intellectually independent individual shapes the language in his turn. Schleiermacher's concept of individuality is linguistically determined, not pre-linguistic, not somehow personal or psychological, but rather a unique combination of shared linguistic resources and individual application. Thus, in the manuscripts on hermeneutics, he defines style not as personality, but as composition and treatment of language. That's a quote from Andrew Bowie's translation of the hermeneutic manuscripts. Thus, in the manuscripts on hermeneutics, Schleiermacher, I've said that, right? You remember that, huh? In the lecture on translation, his materialist theory of language leads to an emphasis on the cultural specificity of linguistic communities. Okay, you don't have this passage. I'll read it out. This is from, again, the lecture on translation. This is Bernowski's translation. One understands speech both as a work of language and as an expression of its spirit, only if, while feeling that only a Hellene, for instance, can have thought and spoken thus, one at the same time feels that only thus can this man have thought and spoken in a Hellenic manner. Only thus can he have seized and worked to shape this language. And what is here manifested is only his living grasp on the richness of the language, his keen sense of rhythm and euphony, and his capacity to think and to fashion. When Schleiermacher turns to translation, however, this sort of linguistic and cultural mediation becomes a fraught issue. He privileges the kind of translating that inscribes the interpretation of the well-educated man, as if this interpretation were more adequate to the source text, regardless of the differences between this language and his mother tongue, of which this person remains ever conscious. Such a translator is not only well acquainted with the foreign language, but can grasp the whole of the source text and take pleasure unhindered in its beauty. Yet, is not the translator's work determined by the translating language and culture, according to the very tenets of Schleiermacher's hermeneutics? Are not these determinations at once enabling and constraining, resulting in a particular interpretation and therefore a particular translation of the source text? Does not Schleiermacher's thinking lead us to expect that a Greek translator will produce a translation that bears the marks of its production in contemporary Greek culture? That it will somehow present a Greek understanding of the foreign text? Instead of addressing or even formulating these questions, Schleiermacher offers an inconsistent account of the foreignness signaled by his preferred kind of translating. On the one hand, he refers to the difficult task of representing the foreign in one's own mother tongue. That's a quote. Where representing renders the German word darstellen, right, a Kantian term, indicating the relative autonomy of the translation from its source. Hence, the differences perceptible in a translation do not result from direct access to the source text. They rather constitute a foreignism, an image of that text, constructed from linguistic patterns and cultural traditions in the receiving situation. A foreignness shaped from and in some relation to receiving cultural values, beliefs, and representations, including representations of the culture where the source text originated. As the lecture unfolds, however, the notion of translation as mediation vanishes. Schleiermacher describes what he calls the true goal of all translation as, this is a quote, the fullest possible unadulterated enjoyment of foreign works, where the translator is engaged in supplying this knowledge of the foreign world, okay, this is a quote, supplying this knowledge of the foreign world by the swiftest, most efficacious means, while allowing the greater lightness and naturalness of the original to shine through everywhere, end of quote. Schleiermacher similarly speaks of the aim of translation as, I'm quoting, facilitating the most direct enjoyment of foreign works, where direct renders the German word genau, a word that might also be translated as true, accurate, exact, or careful. Such passages rest on a concept of equivalence not as variable approximation, but as adequacy to the source. The sense of foreignness is assumed to be an invariant that the translator must reproduce or transfer in the translation. And so Schleiermacher's thinking has seamlessly come to depend on an instrumental model. A similar wavering between instrumentalism and hermeneutics occurs when he considers the strategies that might most effectively signal the differences of the source text. The more precisely the translation, you have this is number 2. The more precisely the translation adheres to the turns and figures of the original, he asserts, the more foreign it will seem to its reader. Schleiermacher again recommends a strategy that assumes the concept of equivalence as adequacy. Syntax and figure are taken as invariants, and to signal the foreignness of the source text, the translator must adhere to them closely so as to reproduce them. But his account of linguistic strategies does not stop here. One must admit, he goes on in the passage, that an indispensable requirement for this method of translating is a disposition of the language that not only departs from the quotidian, but lets one perceive that it was not left to develop freely, but rather was bent to a foreign likeness. The English word quotidian renders the German, you can see it there, alltäglich, which might also be Englished as everyday, ordinary, workaday, implying a routine, familiar, or conversational use of language. What I shall understand as the current standard dialect of the translating language. Schleiermacher imagines the language of translations as departing from current usage to suggest a foreign likeness in its departures, as a hybrid of foreign and receiving linguistic forms, not translation-ese, but occasionally harsh and stiff. That's his phrase. A heterogeneity that undoubtedly resists normative usage to such an extent as to result in mongrels. That's his term, blending in. Departures from the current standard dialect look toward a translation experimentalism that can only deviate as well from the language of the source text, which may not itself contain such departures at those points where the translator chooses to make them in the translating language. Schleiermacher's assumption of the hermeneutic model would seem to give the translator the right to interpret by applying a range of formal interpretants, such as a concept of variable equivalence or a concept of style fitted to a genre or discourse, yet without abandoning the responsibility to signal through these indirect means the differences of the source text. Let me be clear. In seeking to advance a hermeneutic model of translation, in arguing that we must recognize the cultural variability and historical contingency of the translation process and the relative autonomy of the translated text, I am very far from denying that translation is communicative. It does communicate, but no more than an interpretation, not some invariant form, meaning, or effect believed to be inherent in the source text. In inscribing an interpretation, a translation is inevitably a transformation, whereby the source text is rewritten according to the intelligibilities and interests of a different language and culture. To be sure, a translation establishes various relations to the source text. These relations can start with a correspondence to its meaning and include an approximation of the lexical and syntactical features that comprise the style of the source text. But these relations can't stop the transformation, and neither a semantic correspondence nor a stylistic approximation even if they admit of plot summaries and character analyses, summaries of philosophical arguments and explications of conceptual terms, descriptions of a lexicon and syntax and their textual effects, none of the relations established by a translation can be understood as giving back the source text unaltered or enabling the reader of the translation to respond to it in the same way that the source language reader responds to the source text. For a source text, especially in humanistic fields like literature and philosophy, is a complex artifact that supports meanings, values, and functions specific to its originary language and culture. As an interpretive act, the translation potentially engages in a critical dialectic with the source text, in which each interrogates the other, revealing conditions that are unacknowledged and of which the foreign author and the translator are unconscious. Let's take an example. Consider Susan Bernowski's English version of Schleiermacher's lecture. She heard this, so I don't feel bad. She applied a set of formal interpretants. First, a concept of equivalence in which she maintained a semantic correspondence according to dictionary definitions. I'm going to call it a lexicographical equivalence. But she also applied a fairly close adherence to the syntactical constructions of the German text. If you have German, you can see this in the extracts, as far as the structural differences between English and German would allow her to do, so that her sentences match Schleiermacher's in sheer length and complexity. She also cultivated a lexicon that draws predominantly on the current standard dialect of English. But her prose contains departures in the form of archaisms or poeticisms. Here are some examples. Yea, Y-E-A. We must needs employ, okay, that phrase. For the nonce. An organ of apperception. Folly. Wantonness. And the phrase that she ends her translation with, the translator's travails. Susan's translation is Schleiermachian. It brings the reader close to the German text, but the image it creates is decidedly not that text. No, her translation registers the foreignness of Schleiermacher's text in English by deviating from current standard English, from the style of contemporary Anglophone philosophical discourses, and from linguistic strategies deployed in translating foreign philosophical texts where current standard usage continues to prevail. There's an odd inconsistency in her translation, however. It's between several lexical choices, an inconsistency between those and Schleiermacher's recurrent nationalism. His lecture issues a rousing call to German-speaking people to produce foreignizing translations so as to develop the German language and culture. Practicing translation as culture in the most basic sense of education, Bildung. He is delivering his lecture in Berlin as Napoleon's armies invade Prussia. He criticizes Frederick II, the 18th century Prussian monarch, for succumbing to French cultural domination. Here's a quote. All the noblest and finest thoughts of our great king came to him in a foreign language, Schleiermacher laments. He could not possibly have written in German the philosophy and poetry he set down in French. End of quote. Schleiermacher subsequently dismisses the entire French translation tradition as grossly assimilationist or domesticating. Who would claim, he declares, that anything has ever been translated, whether from an ancient or a Germanic tongue, into French? Yet, this is a big yet, Bernowski used French-derived words. I'll say that again. She used French-derived words to render Schleiermacher's account of the foreignizing translator as an amateur and connoisseur. Amateur, as you can see from the passages here, renders Schleiermacher's verb Liebhaber, which can also be translated as enthusiast, fan, even aficionado, okay, to maintain a semantic correspondence. Connoisseur renders Schleiermacher's word, as you can see it there, Kenner, which can also be translated as expert, specialist, authority, master, even, conoscente. Connoisseur is used 4 times in her translation to render Kenner. At the end of the lecture, as you could see in the number 3, the last extract there, the end of the lecture, Schleiermacher himself uses a Gallicism. This phrase, in massa, it's identified as a Gallicism in the Grimm's Brothers Wörterbuch. Okay? Bernowski translates it, as you can see there, with the French expression, en masse, set in italics. Okay. This recurrent use of French and French-derived words, I have to insist on this, should not be judged as erroneous. It's not an error. Okay. That, to call it an error, would assume that the German text is a container of lexical invariants, which must be reproduced in the English version, bringing an instrumental model into play. I prefer to argue that in the context of Schleiermacher's lecture, in the terms of his linguistic and cultural situation as represented therein, against the backdrop of his anti-French sentiments, the French and French-derived words constitute a peculiar but intriguing interpretation that, along with the archaisms, establishes the relative autonomy of Bernowski's translation from the German text. Schleiermacher himself points out in the manuscripts on hermeneutics that interpretation can lead the interpreter to, as he put it, understand the author better than he does himself, because the author's linguistic and cultural situation can remain unconscious. That's Bowie's translation of the German. Bernowski's translation exposes a French unconscious in Schleiermacher, inviting us to perceive that the unacknowledged conditions of his discourse are actually French. In the early 1980s, Hans Aarsleff made clear that the key ideas linked to German thinkers such as Herder and Humboldt, the so-called principle of linguistic relativity, with its associate doctrines of the ultimate subjectivity of speech and its social nature, that's a quote from Aarsleff, these originated with the French ideologues during the 18th century. These ideas then became central to Schleiermacher's thinking, and his formulations do seem to echo those set forth in Condillac's Essay on the Origin of Human Knowledge, 1746. Condillac was a great admirer of Locke, so things are just moving in a circle here. Thus, Condillac's conception of language bears a strong resemblance to Schleiermacher's, although the French philosopher singles out what he calls eminent men in his statement. Or is this comparable to Schleiermacher's Kenner? This is a quote from Aarsleff's translation of Condillac. Though eminent men in some respects share the character of their nation, they always have something that sets them apart from it. They see and feel in their own particular way, and to express their manner of seeing and feeling, they are obliged to imagine new expressions within the rules of analogy or with as little deviation from those rules as possible. Thus, they conform to the genius of their language, while at the same time adding their own. The most startling resemblance appears when Condillac asserts that, I'm quoting again from Aarsleff's translation, the language of each nation expresses the character of the people who speak it. Although Condillac accepts what he calls cold and phlegmatic people who are more difficult to size up. I love that size up. That's Aarsleff. Who are more cold and phlegmatic people who are more difficult to size up since they readily conform to the way other people speak. End of quote. Schleiermacher closes his lecture by referring to what he calls the Nordic lassitude of the German-speaking people, which, as he puts it, prevents us from exercising our language sufficiently. Yet it is these people, okay, for Schleiermacher, because of their esteem for the foreign and their own mediating nature, who are best suited to foreignizing translation. Although the German Romantics initiated a translation tradition that aggressively opposed the French tendency toward domesticating paraphrase, the tradition of Les Belles Infidèles, the conception of language that sowed the seeds of German nationalism was first articulated by French thinkers. The interpretation I have located in Bernowski's translation is obviously not deferential toward Schleiermacher's text. It's rather differential, distinctly interrogative. It enacts what Paul Ricoeur has called a hermeneutics of suspicion, such as practiced by thinkers from Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud to Althusser and Derrida. In 2009, when I shared this reading with the translator, she confessed to being unconscious of any peculiarity in her verbal choices. That as far as she could recall a project she had completed in 2003, she was rather intent on maintaining a semantic correspondence, perhaps assuming the instrumental model that most translators and readers of translation continue to assume today. Yet, her translation belies any instrumental notion of a source invariant. Her Gallicisms do maintain a semantic correspondence, but they simultaneously allow for an interrogation of Schleiermacher's nationalist thinking, which in turn comes back to worry the consistency of Bernowski's concept of equivalence. Instrumentalism cannot account for Bernowski's work with any incisiveness or comprehensiveness. To make sense of what she has done, we must rather apply a different sort of interpretant, a hermeneutics that is open-ended enough to account not only for the translator's complicated interpretive act, but also for its unacknowledged conditions and its unanticipated consequences. And that, I suggest, is the way to advance the study and practice of translation. Thank you for listening to me.